welcome once again to another extra special, or should I say terrestrial, episode of What Happened, the show that, yep, I'm doing E.T. One of the most well-known stories / myths / legends of the video game industry. Now, I'm aware this monumental misfire has been covered backwards and forwards for decades. Hell, some huge Nerdosaurus Rex even made a whole damn movie about it. But it's now finally time to give this wrinkly weirdo the what happened treatment. E.T. It's 1982 and Atari is at the literal height of their video game dominance, owning some 80% of the market due to the success of their 2600 model and almost none due to their 5200. They acquired the license for E.T. the Extraterrestrial in August of the same year, as the movie proved to be another Spielberg blockbuster when it opened earlier that summer. Atari reportedly paid an almost unheard of sum of $20 to $25 million for the rights to make a game adaptation, so it only made sense that they would assign one of their star programmers, Howard Scott Warshaw, for the job. He was responsible for previous platinum-selling hits like Yar's Revenge and Raiders of the Lost Ark, and Steven Spielberg himself had specifically requested his services, as he had been impressed with the latter. Now, you can say a lot about the esoteric nature of the Atari version of Raiders, but it did the two things Atari valued most when adapting other media: have at least some recognizable things from the film, in this case, Indy's hat and a snake, and be completed on time. When Atari upper management called Warshaw, they laid on the pressure nice and thick by saying that this was going to be the most important game they'll ever make. Unfortunately, no one realized just how big of a hit E.T. was going to be, so many licensees were late to the party to capitalize on its success, and Atari was very much one of them. Therefore, they let Warshaw in on the caveat: the game had to be finished and ready to go in 5 weeks to allow for cart manufacturing times, as well as give the marketing campaign a head start leading into Christmas. For Atari, the holiday shopping season was paramount, especially for a game aimed at children, so this release date was ironclad. If Warshaw was to accept, he had to deliver. Now, in the early 80s, most games could take anywhere from 5 to 10 months to complete. For example, it took Warshaw 9 months to make Raiders of the Lost Ark, and he had little over 1 month for E.T. In the Netflix documentary High Score, Warshaw spoke about his thought process when considering the offer. "No one's ever done it, and no one would think of doing it. It's a stupid idea, you know? Nobody would do it. It's ridiculous. So I said, absolutely I can. There was no hesitation, and no doubt in my mind I could do this. I'm not exactly sure what I was full of, but whatever it was, I was overflowing with it." The moment Warshaw accepted this impossible task, he was instructed by his bosses that he would then need to get on a plane, meet with Steven Spielberg, and present his design for the game he hadn't even started yet in 2 days. Warshaw, knowing that the clock was already ticking, designed something that could be completed in 5 weeks, a series of screens players would navigate which could be randomized to present new challenges. Not dissimilar to what he did for Raiders, but obviously way more basic and, unforgiving. 36 hours later, he was in front of Spielberg and had just finished explaining the concept. The director was in deep thought for a moment or two before finally asking, "Couldn't you do something more like Pac-Man?" Flummoxed, Warshaw then explained his version would be true to the film and would be far more appropriate than doing a simple knockoff, to which Steven said, "Okay," and signed off on the design. The fact of the matter, though, was that Warshaw was experienced enough to know that his design was the only thing that could be completed with such a rushed schedule. Anything that needed to be meticulously handcrafted, like the mazes of Pac-Man or, say, Adventure, were far too ambitious and time-consuming. So what followed was an intense 35-day period where Warshaw lived and breathed E.T. Virtually nothing else existed in my life other than the game. I worked all the time. I almost killed myself in my car because I was coding in my head instead of watching what I was doing. I could be eating with people, and in my head, I'm still coding. I even had a development system moved into my home so that wherever I am, I'm never more than a minute from being able to get to a keyboard to start writing the code I need to put in. Programmers working from home for Atari was almost unheard of in the early 80s, as the company was hesitant to allow workstations out of their sight lest programmers go into business for themselves, which is something we'll get to a bit later. With the design clear and his deadline set, it then took Warshaw's dedication, confidence, or hubris, call it what you want, to simply get the job done, working almost every day non-stop until September 1st. His labors were not done, however, as he still needed to present the finished game to Spielberg to get the final seal of approval. Warshaw explained the game and its objective once more and nervously watched over the director's shoulder as he played, most likely falling into pits countless times. After a while, he turned to Warshaw, an unreadable expression on his face, and said, "I love it!" Yeah, you might think Steven would have been a bit picky or unsure of what had just been presented to him, but for whatever reason, he gave the all clear.
Of course I'm biased, I made the movie.
I mean, this is the guy who said no one will ever cry over a scene in a video game, so take his opinion with a truck full of salt. With everything set to go, the marketing machine started gearing up. E.T. was coming, kids, so hold on to your butts! Upon its December release day, at least initially, it made a huge splash, topping the sales charts at number 3, just behind the Coleco version of Donkey Kong and Activision's Pitfall. It's been estimated that E.T.'s launch sales numbers easily soared past 1 million copies, which in most circumstances would be a blockbuster success, but critical reception was not so favorable. Reviews at the time held nothing back, calling it crude and frustrating and well below the expectations most people had for a game based on such a loved and cherished motion picture. Now, let's not mince words. If E.T. seemed like a confusing mess that felt really rushed, well, that's because it was. And Warshaw admitted, outside of the concessions he had to make in order to get it done in time, that the game had issues that were more aggravating than he had originally intended. Specifically, the feeling of disorientation when transitioning to a new screen or area, which could even occur randomly due to bugs. When you are designing and coding, you need to periodically sit back and play what you've done thus far to try and experience it through fresh eyes. But with only 5 weeks, it was something he simply couldn't afford to do. With that said, there are plenty of games of the time that were just as confusing or even worse than E.T., but because this was based on a very popular movie, and with Atari pushing it in everyone's face leading up to Christmas '82, it wound up disappointing pretty much everyone who played it. The hype was just that real. If the game had simply been called, I don't know, Potato Face and His Glowing Finger, it wouldn't have received nearly the ire it wound up getting. Regardless, the real villain of this tale is not so much the game, but Atari's overconfidence in it. They had ordered and manufactured around 4 million copies in total, and as the weeks went on, the game dropped out of the top 10 very quickly, just as quickly as carts were being returned for refunds across the nation. While the game did continue to sell, its drop-off was sudden, and thus Atari was stuck with a mountain of unsold games. Midway through 1983, the gaming industry itself quickly tumbled into a downward spiral, with E.T. being used as a sort of scapegoat. Now, while it's true that it probably didn't help, the game's release just happened to coincide with a bunch of other, far more potent factors. I mentioned Activision earlier, and I will mention them again. The company was formed by a number of ex-Atari programmers who felt mistreated and undervalued, whereupon they all quit and started their own Atari with Blackjack and Hook. Shut the hell up! Their next step was copying Atari's own cartridge format so they could release their own games, thus becoming the first third-party developer. Atari failed to block this process in court, as a judge ruled that as long as a different game or product was in the cartridge shell, Atari could not block its sale. With the legal floodgates open, the market was soaked in a deluge of games published by no-name companies you couldn't possibly name. Thus, thousands of ET quality titles were stuffed into store shelves, disillusioning many a video game fan. The market went from a $3.2 billion industry in 1983 to a mere $100 million by 1985, which meant no company was doing well enough to keep their doors open. The misses kept on coming, however, as Atari had been involved in a deal to produce an American version of a little Japanese console called the Famicom, as Nintendo themselves weren't sure how to adapt the machine for the West. At the last possible minute, Atari backed out of the deal, as it had had enough of low-performing machines and remodels in recent years, so they felt it wasn't worth investing in another one, leaving Nintendo to figure it out on their own. And yeah, figure it out they did. By the end of the 80s, Nintendo owned 90% of the market, becoming bigger than Atari ever was. And thus we arrive at the last lingering fringe of this story. What did Atari do with the millions of unsold ET cartridges? Well, they buried them in a New Mexico landfill. Thanks again to William down at the Flophouse VIP Patreon for nominating E.T. for this week's episode. And if you know of any— Okay. Norman, the gaming historian, would be fuming if I misreported this story for the 100th time. No, Atari did not dump millions of unsold copies of E.T. in some type of embarrassment pit, but they did get rid of a random stockpile of electronics and games from an old manufacturing plant they had in El Paso, Texas. When times were getting rough for the company, they tightened their belts by moving their cart productions over to Taiwan, while their Texas plant would be converted to a service center. That meant that they had a variety of spare parts, games, and accessories just taking up space, so they decided to dump them. Now, at the time, Texas had zero regulations when it came to landfills, meaning anyone could just root through the pile of old electronics at their leisure. But in Alamogordo, New Mexico, there were laws in place to stop such looting, so Atari had the stockpile of electronics dumped there instead. Despite their best efforts to keep a lid on this, locals still found out about this purge, eventually making its way into local newspapers. Atari then admitted some 35 years ago that yes, they buried some unsold stock because they were moving their manufacturing plant to Asia. Nothing to see here, folks, we're doing fine. Nothing embarrassing happening here at all. And before you bring it up, yes, in 2014 the New Mexico landfill was excavated, where they found plenty of games and accessories, but with only 10% of them being actual ET cartridges. So this mythic, ancient Atari graveyard was both fact and fiction, with its origin being exaggerated throughout the years Purple Monkey dishwasher.
Well, we'll show him, especially for that Purple Monkey dishwasher remark.
As for Howard Warshaw, well, he quit the video game industry soon after E.T.'s release, and Atari went on to become even more irrelevant in the decades to come. So yes, while the E.T. video game would have been better off, not existing, it wasn't this cursed harbinger of the video game apocalypse, and wasn't even the only flop Atari was at the center of. Just a few months before they had nabbed the license for the film, Atari upper management had rushed out a sloppy, almost unplayable port of Pac-Man, which they also over-manufactured to the tune of another 4 million units, with the vast majority also going unsold. So E.T. was not this unique one-time blunder, but rather a tradition of nearsightedness and greed for the once dominant video game company. Alright, for reals this time. If you know of any other supposed video game destroying video games or movies, let me know in the comments below, over on my Twitter, or phone home to the Flophouse VIP Patreon and become a big boss and nominate what you'd like me to cover in the future. See you next time, and thanks for watching!